Hello, and welcome to English Writing Essentials for Middle School Students. My name is Rose Chang, and I would like to discuss with you today what exactly this lecture will be and the information that will be discussed when regarding the students and their essay writing specifically. Now, before we begin, we need to ask the question of, what do all middle school students end up having in common? Now, this is a very big problem for many students, teachers, and parents alike because we always want to know, what exactly does the student need help with? Now, for many students, it might be a specific subject, but for all students, we all end up having struggles with essay writing in particular, which is the reason for the creation of this lecture series, which will be discussing the essentials for essay writing and writing in general. So, in this class, we will be discussing how to really understand what we are writing, taught both in theory as well as in practice by me, a native speaker, and this will be a condensed course. So an easy way to think of this is to make sure that the students will not be talking about extraneous detail or information that might not be necessary for their level at the moment. It will only be need-to-know basis as well as specifically designed for the middle school level as well. Then, another thing we would like to discuss is that it will also be taught in 100% English. Now, this is very important. We will discuss this later on, but this is an important part of the lecture that we need to keep in mind as it will only be discussed in English. Then, there will also be detailed explanations regarding the subjects that are absolutely need to know, as well as key takeaways, but most importantly, the point of this lecture series is to make sure the student knows how to write like a native speaker. This is the most important point and cannot be stressed enough. So within this course, we will be discussing the foundations for the essays, as well as specifically for the demographic, study abroad students, as well as English theory, then, of course, middle and high school writing, which is kind of important because of the fact that they overlap in many different ways, and then the key takeaways each lesson after everything has been discussed, everything has been taught to the student regarding each topic. There is always a key takeaway that they have to know before they move on to the crash course review, which will be available after every single chapter for perhaps the students to look at and review so they understand exactly what exactly was on the lectures beforehand before they move on to the next. So we have to ask the question of, why do students dislike writing in the first place? This is another thing that a lot of teachers and students and parents end up having questions and difficulty with because of how often this occurs. Well, to begin, challenging and hard to sound academic for many students, as well as unable to organize their thoughts, cannot think of the right words to use, as well as they struggling to think of good ideas, especially for their essays and their topics specifically. So, throughout all of these, there's probably going to be one that you may think is very important that we discuss. However, more important than that is the problem to write perfectly, the pressure of writing perfectly. In fact, your student is probably thinking to themselves, how am I going to make sure that my essay turns out perfect each and every single time? And this will cause a lot of pressure for them, especially since they struggle with the following: awkward grammar, self-conscious writing style, a weaker vocabulary than most, as well as simple statements. Now, all of these combined end up allowing the student to feel the pressure of having to write perfectly. If it is one of the four, then in fact the student might end up perhaps studying a bit more and this will be easier. However, because of these four reasons, all students tend to write poorly as well as struggle to do well. This is the reason for this Essentials course in particular, because we will be addressing all four styles and all four types of difficulties that most students tend to experience when they are writing in English. Especially for the students who are required to learn abroad. So, for abroad students, this is something that they will be going through quite often, which is to think critically and do the 3 R's in any given class. So, to rethink, reflect, as well as reconstruct the information that they are taught. All students will be required to write strong essays in their academic career as well. They might be a middle school student now, but the moment they get to high school, they will be taking advanced courses, AP courses, IB courses, and perhaps when they get into university, even their university will be predominantly English speaking. So with all this in mind, when do we start our foundation learning? When do we get the basics down so the student will be able to write very strong native-like essays by the time they get to high school or perhaps university? Well, the time is now. The objective of this lecture series will be to discuss and to teach middle schoolers how to write specifically book reports, argumentative essays, persuasive papers, and descriptive paragraphs. And here, when I say middle school students, I say this in regards to students between the grades 6 through 9, as well as learning the proper academic grammar and writing techniques that will be necessary for any student, especially if they are predominantly English writers. And most importantly, how to write like a native English speaker. This is very important as well. For many students and for many teachers and for many parents, this is probably one of the biggest things, especially because they want to make sure that their child can write and speak like a native. This is important, but this will also be discussed in this lecture series. But why is this lesson plan so important and so different than the ones that are out there? Well, students are never explicitly taught how to write strong and thorough paragraphs or essays. They are never explicitly told by their teachers in school or by their tutors. They are taught a format. However, they do not know why the format is so important, which we will be discussing. Then, the entire course will also be performed in English. Now, this is something that I mentioned earlier, but is important to mention again now, because it is to enhance effectiveness of the lesson itself. So, for a student who struggles with comprehension, perhaps reading, perhaps responding, this is the perfect course for them because it will require them, especially the students who have difficulties, to really understand what it is that they're learning, really understand exactly what is necessary for a proper essay in particular. So who is this course for? I said 6th or 9th graders, but also it can be for students or anybody who ends up having difficulties with perhaps grammar, perhaps vocabulary, flow, or in fact anybody who needs help with their communication skills, as this is a lecture that will be discussing not just perhaps these aspects, but also how to really get your thoughts across, how to really get your ideas across. Especially for students who have difficulties with this, this is one of the key things that many teachers can see as them not being a native writer. So this is another important point that we will be discussing in this lecture series. And then lastly, of course, expanding students' literature knowledge because of the fact that they are not quite well read, or perhaps because their reading lists are not gone through completely or cohesively yet. And so for those reasons, this is a very important course for students to take. Another thing we can say about this course is that it will allow students to get used to reading or perhaps understanding and writing essays on topics of all different natures and all different varieties. Then practice for grammar, vocabulary, and comprehension all in one. And lastly, learn how to break down an entire book and understand what exactly the author's intentions are, specifically when I say this in our literary devices department. Now with that is the intro for our course today, and this is a little bit about myself. I am a native-born, native-bred American, and I went through all middle school, high school, in America while I was there. And then lastly, of course, I came to Korea to study university. I studied in English language literature department and did an intensive study in this course, graduated with great honors, and I am currently a university specialist, so I will focus most of my attention on university admissions exams, as well as actually writing and helping students out with their admissions essays themselves. And of course, currently I am working as an SAT teacher, as well as a TOEFL SEM who has done writing, speaking, listening, and reading over the past several years. Now with that, I want to leave you guys off on this note, which is that this lecture series will allow us to have the perfect foundation for the perfect essay. Without the perfect foundation, a perfect essay cannot exist. But where do we learn this foundation? Where will we be able to understand and really grasp the basics that are necessary to write the perfect essay? Well, that all starts in middle school and starts to this lecture series that will allow your student to understand what is necessary, what is needed, what are the foundations of writing in particular. And with that, I am done, and thank you for listening. For today, we're going to be discussing transition words and phrases. Now, this is something that I would argue is probably the most important part of good native-like essay writing. Now, I know we're all here so we can learn how to write like a native. So I need you guys to pay extra close attention to this section because it's gonna go quite long, but we need to really discuss what transitions are, how to use them, and how they differ, okay? So let's go over the objectives for today. Because flow is imperative to a good native-like essay, we need to make sure that we are familiarized with transitions, explore the varieties that we can be using, as well as recognizing the nuance of each transition, as well as their meanings and their phrasing. So remember, because we want to avoid repetition at all costs, this also applies to transitions. Now, you may be wondering, how does this work? But let me explain, and we will understand why repetition is not just sentence structure or commentary, but also transition words. Because this is probably one of the biggest egregious errors that students can create when they are writing their essays. And so I don't want us to be like those types of students who use the same 4 transitions throughout their essays, okay? So let's see what we can do. Transition words and phrases are often used just to connect ideas between sentences of paragraphs. It can be used, in fact, in all parts of the essays. Essays themselves are just methods to give your opinion to others, but that does not mean that it has to be very cut and dry. By adding transition words, which the name suggests, it creates a transition from one idea to the next. That way, there's no break in the thought process that is the essay. Now, the reason why I say that this is probably the most important part for native-like writing is because native writers will use transitions to be able to properly show how their brain is functioning. When you are thinking about something, when you are thinking about whether or not you want to eat lunch maybe, you think about one thing, then you move on to the next, then you move on to the next. Maybe I should eat chicken, or perhaps I'll eat a burger. With these kinds of ideas, there are tiny transitions in the middle there that give more context and help with the flow of your sentences, or just your thought process in general. And so, we want to be able to use these throughout our essay, regardless of really where it is. However, I will note that they are usually found in the beginnings or sometimes in the middle of the sentences themselves. I would argue that the concluding section of a sentence does not really have any transitions. If it does, it's very rare, and I wouldn't really worry too much about it. For us, what we really want to focus on is the beginning transition. We want to talk about the transitions in the very beginning, because this is where we will really show that we know how to work flow into our essay like a native writer. So, to begin, I have to make a big warning. As you can clearly tell, there's a very big warning I need to make, which is that for anyone who has written an essay before, these are some common transitions you will have seen. In fact, your teacher may even say, please use these. However, I would argue that maybe you want to avoid them, in fact. First, second, third, then, lastly, and finally. These are the types of words that we want to probably avoid as writers who want to do more than just the bare minimum. I'm assuming that you don't want to just do the bare minimum, that you want to do the extra step, that you want to go the extra mile just to make sure that you can get that A+ and really show how much flow and how native-like you can actually write. And so we want to avoid these ones. In fact, I would argue that people just in general should avoid these transitions because of many different reasons. Will you be marked down? No, you won't be marked down. In fact, it will be perfectly valid. This is often used on the TOEFL exam as well as the old SAT essay portion. However, there's nothing particular about it that will make it stand out. Again, your writing has to be interesting and investing, and having a transition such as first is quite bland. It's very straightforward. It doesn't really add too much to the conversation, and it only really serves a function. And so, again, only serves a purpose. We want to avoid this. We want to be able to play around with our words. That is why writing is so important and very interesting for many people, because if we're able to really show the purpose of our writing, but do it in an interesting, informative way, then your writing will stand out and you will definitely get a higher score than your peers. And so that is why I want to really reiterate that you don't want to use very simple, archaic, perhaps, commonly used transitions such as first, second, third, then, lastly, and finally. So, just to begin, let's start with agreement, addition, and similarity, okay? And so this is going to have several parts, but let's just go through this slowly together. And in fact, I would argue that you have seen the majority of these, but we just don't know how to use them. So let's go over that together, and I'll give you some sample questions, sample sentences, and we will see how this can be used. So here, let's look at the chart. In the first place, in like manner, in addition, in the same way, not only but also, coupled with, not to mention, to say nothing of, moreover, correspondingly, similarly, and furthermore. Now, those are a lot of words. Do you have to memorize them all? Absolutely not. You do not have to memorize any of this. However, I will suggest that you take a very close look at the next sample sentences and also think to yourself, which ones do I prefer? The ones that you do have to memorize, however, are the ones that you want to use. In fact, the ones that you want to use, I would even argue you want to keep an idea of which ones I want to use where. I'll get into that a little bit later, but let's just look at the transition words for now. Example 1, in addition, it is important that people get to rest after a long day of hard work. Now, the sentence itself we're not going to be looking at today. We've already talked ad nauseum about that. So let's talk about the transitions themselves. In addition, as you can see, I've bolded it in both the sentence and in the chart, but in addition is talking about, again, agreement, addition, similarity. When you want to make another point, this is the type of transition that you want to use. By the way, in addition, to add on to, when you want to say, by the way, there's another point that I want to make. Oh, actually, wait, hold on a second. I need to make sure that you understand something here. Let me make another point. That is how you do it here. You use one of these types of transitions. So, does that mean all of them work? I mean, yeah, they do. In fact, they all pretty much work the exact same way. However, the meanings can be a little bit different. Then, let's look at not only but also and then furthermore. Not only, but also. As you can see, there's a tiny ellipses in the middle. Ellipses being the 3 periods. This means it trails off. Not only, but also. Now, this is one of the very rare transitions that have to be put both parts into a sentence. It cannot just be not only. You also have to have but also. This you just have to memorize as a whole if you're going to be using this transition, which I highly recommend. You have to memorize this as a whole. Not only will courses in English be offered, but also courses taught in Chinese and Japanese. If we did not have the but also, this sentence would be grammatically incorrect and the transition would be incorrectly used. So it's very important that we add the but also. However, there is one condition to this rule. Depending on the sentence, which I do not think that you will be encountering anytime soon, but depending on the sentence, you may not have to use the word also. Sometimes the word also is optional. So for our sake, I would say that it is mandatory. However, just do know that sometimes just because the also is not there does not mean that the transition is used incorrectly. It just may be a different style of sentence. Then we have the word furthermore. This is one of the words that I would highly recommend. This is also one of the words that I see most often in any form of writing. In fact, I use this quite a bit in my own writing as well. Furthermore, companies are going to be able change their marketing tactics again. So here, we want to use the word furthermore because this is also in addition, to continue on. A sister word to this would be the word moreover. Moreover and furthermore are very interchangeable, as well as in addition. These are the words that I would use in this section. Then let's go completely the other way. Opposition, limitation, and contradiction. Provide contrast and point out alternatives to whatever you've already said. Yes, I can eat a piece of chicken for lunch. However, I want to eat perhaps a waffle instead. Then this is where you would use these types of words. If you're saying one thing, but then you want to make a counterpoint. You want to say something different that is opposite to something you've already said before. So let's look at the words together. In contrast, on the other hand, on the contrary, although this may be true. Instead, whereas, rather, otherwise, despite, however, nevertheless, and regardless. These are the words that we want to be using when we are, again, opposing an idea that we've already mentioned. So this is it. We've made it. finally, we've come to the conclusion of our essay. And now our conclusion part of our essay will either take place as a paragraph or a sentence. And that is what we will be discussing for this lesson on how to properly end an essay that you have spent your time and your effort on, and to make sure that it is appropriate enough for you to turn it in and get that A+. So let's talk about the objectives. Is it ready to be turned in? Well, not quite. We still need that conclusion, even though it's at the very end. We need to make sure that this is done correctly, or else this might actually jeopardize our grade. So we need to pay close attention to what we are writing. We will learn how to condense our entire essay into a few lines, as well as create a lasting impression that will express the importance of our findings to the reader, the teacher, and have them understand exactly what our perspective is one last time before they go in and give us our final mark. But most importantly, we are trying to tell our readers that we have officially and successfully expressed the reasons for our argument in a very clear and concise manner. And perhaps if we have not done that by now, and we haven't caught that in our grading or our personal peer editing, that we want to make it much clearer to them one last time at the very end. That way there is no confusion. So something that we need to know before we begin talking in depth about the conclusion paragraph is that your writing will be either the easiest or the hardest part of the essay. Conclusions are always either the easiest or the hardest parts. It is never in the middle. Reason being, this all depends on how well you did on your introduction paragraph, okay? Remember how I talked about in the introduction paragraph that there are a lot of people who struggle with that? In the same way, the conclusion will be the hardest part. The body paragraphs are always the easiest part of an essay. So if you have difficulties with this process, don't fear, you're not the only person. I was also that type of student. So it is not something that we will always be forced into. Something that we will always learn from is how to write a good conclusion regardless of what we are writing about. Key point though that we do want to mention is that if you were able to write a strong thesis in your introductory paragraph, that you were and will be much more prepared to write your conclusion this time around. Well, why is that? We'll get into that in a second, but it's very important that we spend a lot of time on our introduction for this reason. And fun fact, that is also why a lot of students will wait till the very end to write their introduction so they can write it alongside their conclusion, because they will be a mirror of one another. In fact, the introduction and the conclusion are incredibly similar and sometimes can, in certain essays, depending on the writer, be even switched around because they are so similar. That is what a conclusion is. It is a restatement of the purpose of your essay. And where do we see that in the first time? The introduction paragraph. So that is why we want to pay attention to the intro paragraph. Format of a good conclusion should include a general template that we will follow. This is probably the most lenient of all formats because there is no set number of sentences. The amount of sentences that you can use to write your conclusion paragraph, or perhaps conclusion sentence, is up to you. However, it is highly recommended that you do not go over 3 or 4, because then you are mostly perhaps restating something that you have already stated before, adding detail that is not necessary for conclusion, or even worse off, you are introducing a new idea that you should not be introducing. So we want to keep the rule that it can be anywhere from 1 to 3 sentences long. This is also depending on the length of your essay. If it is longer than that you have added too much and you should cut it down in some place. Again, if your conclusion is looking the same length as one of your body paragraphs, then there's something off about that and we want to cut that down. Your conclusion should not be the same size as a body paragraph. In fact, it should even be shorter than your introductory paragraph. So please keep that in mind when you are writing it. So what is the format that I'm talking so much about that, we don't have to follow too much? Well, it is this. We have to restate our thesis, the main point that we want to discuss, our supporting ideas and main points that we have mentioned within the essay, and then any final thoughts or closing sentences that we want to make for the reader as a lasting impression. These are the only 3 things that are necessary in a conclusion paragraph, and oftentimes some of them, especially the third one, can be switched out depending on the necessity for time or if the essay is done in a standardized test. In these kinds of instances, our final thoughts and closing sentences can be omitted or taken out, but oftentimes when we are writing an essay at home, we want to keep all 3. This is because this is what is needed to create a very solid, incorporated, good conclusion that will end your essay properly, okay? So we want to use this format when we are writing any other essay for our classes. So we start with the first sentence, the first part of our three-part conclusion, which is the restatement of the thesis. Again, our thesis is the first time we're seeing it since we've seen it in our introduction. Let's go over it real quick. It is the main reason for writing the essay in the first place. So the question that you are trying to answer, that is your thesis. It is also going to be the last sentence of your introductory paragraph because that is what leads into our body paragraphs. If you're going to talk about pollution, then you will talk about pollutions point 1, 2, and 3. But our thesis is still that you are going to talk about pollution, and that is what our thesis is going to be. Your entire essay is represented in this sentence. Remind the reader why it is so important. If you have forgotten what you've been writing about this entire time, which is absolutely possible, absolutely fair, if it happens, don't worry, it happens to the best of us, then it is important to restate it. Why? Because it might not just be you, it might also be the reader themselves. We must restate exactly what it is that we set out to do, what it is that we set out to discuss. Please remember to change the wording of the sentence so it does not read as repetitive. This should be a no-brainer for us at this point. We want to avoid repetition. There are hundreds upon thousands of words in the English language, and to repeat is going to be bad on us and it will look bad on our vocabulary. So we want to avoid being repetitive, and this is where our summarizing and our our summarizing and our paraphrasing skills come into play because that is what we will essentially be doing with our introduction. So, how can we have good thesis statements and then good restated theses? Well, let's look at an example thesis statement that I have conjured from thin air, and we'll be looking at this and how it can translate into a restated thesis, okay? So, let's say that we're talking about public libraries. Public libraries should be funded more because they are spaces to study, offer community courses, and give free access to information. If you've ever gone to a library, you will know that this is a very true statement and that sometimes public libraries, they're not funded by the government that much. So sometimes they have older books, sometimes their electronics are quite old as well, and that this statement is pretty much saying that it's important that we give back to our community and we support public libraries. That is the argument that this statement is making. So how would we make a conclusion restatement if we were to write a conclusion about this essay? Well, we don't necessarily need the three main points, so let's just condense that and let's make it different. As a government-funded building, the public library has many uses and benefits for its community. So instead of listing our 3 points, we just say many uses and benefits. This is enough for the thesis statement. When I say it like this in your head, you should be probably thinking, okay, so this is possible. It's not too difficult because all we're doing is just restating the topic of our essay. We don't have to get into details. We're just talking about restating the topic of our essay. So let's look at another one. People should attend university because they can get a degree, find new academic interests, and meet a variety of new people. Whether or not you agree with this point is moot because this is still just a thesis statement. So how do we translate this into a conclusion restatement? How do we rewrite this so it doesn't look the same but it means the exact same thing? Given these points, it is clear that people can have a variety of new experiences. That's how we summarize it. That will help them prepare for their future. In fact, you could take out anything after that, have a variety of new experiences, period. And that is enough. It's up to you how much detail you want to add, but this is all we need, that it is important that they have a variety of new experiences. And if you're thinking to yourself, but that doesn't feel like that's enough information, well, it does show up later on as to why we need our supporting points and our main ideas, which leads into our next sentence or our next point. Each paragraph has its own subtopic. As you can tell, when you are writing your essay, when you have your thesis statement, you make certain points that you're going to discuss. Then you discuss them in your paragraphs one at a time. Same thing here, each paragraph has its own subtopic, so you discuss one point in particular. Reiterate those points or repeat them, restate them, and support your argument. So we have learned exactly what is necessary to write a good and proper essay. So let's take a look at some examples, paragraphs and essays, and try to understand what we want to add into our own, okay? So this is going to be more like a workshop. Let's try to figure out what is done right and what we want to keep for our own writing, okay? So for today, what we want to do is make sure that we can understand these paragraphs and essays very well and see how they use the techniques that we've mentioned so far throughout this course and how they properly utilize them so the essays themselves are quite solid and well written. So these are going to be examples that we want to strive for in our essays. They are different styles of paragraphs broken down by year. So we have 6th through 7th grade and then 8th through 9th grade. As we can tell by the fact that it's broken up like this, there will be essays that are somewhat simpler than the others. However, for a native writer, this should be the standard of essay writing that we should be seeing. So because of that, we want to look at the different styles that we could be approaching. Now, if you feel that this is something out of your league by any chance throughout this lesson, do not fret, because honestly, these essays are mostly just written this way to show as a sample, okay? So please keep that in mind that not all students will write like this, but rather it is something we should be striving for if we are in this year. Next, we're going to be discussing some common points across all essays that we want to emulate or recreate in our own essays, and as well as some advanced phrases that are easy to use that we can adopt into our own essays. Now, you may think to yourself, okay, but if these are advanced phrases that are easy to use and you're asking us to use them, wouldn't that be considered plagiarism? Well, in fact, that wouldn't be, because as we talked about before, if we're quoting somebody else, then that's considered plagiarizing. However, here, using these advanced phrases, this isn't considered plagiarizing because mostly we are just using certain terms of phrase that are often used in academic writing. So this would not be something that we have to worry too much about in the legality of all things. This is something that we want to be looking forward to in our essay writing, and in fact, adopting from writing that we personally like. So keep that in mind throughout when we're going over these paragraphs and essays. If there's something that you like, keep a lookout for it, highlight it, rewrite it down somewhere, and maybe use it in one of your own essays. And lastly, again, take a glance at well-written essays and see how we can emulate it in our own. So apply what we want. If you only want to take the transitions, take the transitions. If you want to take the sentence structures, take the sentence structures. But the majority of what we're going to be doing today is just going over a few good sample essays for us to see how everything, again, that we've learned so far can be applied in our own writing. So up until now, we have only focused on parts of the writing, but I do not think that this is enough. We need to look at the essay as a whole, okay? So do not just focus on the intro, even though it may be the most difficult part. And we should not also pay most attention to the conclusion. We want to be paying attention to the entire thing as a whole. Same thing goes with the body paragraphs. We don't want to be focusing all our attention and our time on that. So we need to have a cohesive work instead of a one single standout paragraph. If this is the case, then you want to make sure that the rest of your essay matches up to that standout paragraph. Do not rely on a single paragraph to get you a good grade, because that is only one part of 5, okay? So keep that in mind. And again, use this lesson as a review before we apply it to a different type of assignment. You've probably seen the syllabus by now. We're going to be talking about book reports and argumentative essays. So because of that, we really want to understand how to write a perfect essay, a proper essay, what a good essay format is. And so this is going to be our final review for that until the end of the lesson as a whole. Please keep that in mind. So let's start off with our 6th through 7th grade paragraph, okay? We're going to go paragraphs, then we're going to go essays. But I think this is a very good example of a good 6th or 7th paragraph that, while it looks very complicated, is actually quite not. The concepts are very simple, or they are described very clearly, and we can clearly see the aspects that I've been discussing a lot lately. So we have our transition, we have our solid thesis, we have the breakdown of our point, and then our commentary. So let's look at this together and see how this is broken down and see what we can take away from this. So I'm going to read this out. Follow along with me. Until we take action to pass new laws, Drivers at least need to be more responsible when using cell phones. The American Automobile Association recommends that drivers pull off the road before using a cell phone, have a passenger use it for them, or use voicemail to answer calls. Another suggestion is to keep the phone off while moving or simply not to use it in the car. Before using a cell phone, drivers should think to themselves, is this call really that important? Now, looking at this paragraph, it is quite long, but when we break it down, again, the concept should be something you've heard of before. This is a problem in many countries where there are too many people looking on their cell phones while they are driving. That is what this paragraph is talking about, how there needs to be more action taken to prevent people from using cell phones, or at least being more responsible when they're using their cell phones while they're driving. Now, what do we want to take away from this? What do we want to really pay attention to here? Well, let's look at the transitions that they use. So we have the word until, saying, emphasizing that until something happens, something else has to happen before we do something else. We need to make sure that they need to be more responsible until there are new laws passed. We cannot wait for the laws to come through. We need to put this into action now. That is the first thing we want to look at. Then another suggestion. This is another way of saying in addition. And then we also have before using a cell phone as a lead-in to the question, is this call really that important? Now, I remember telling you guys that we don't want to use rhetorical questions, but this is not really used in that kind of way. This question is not really used in that sense. This is more of a question that is being used as a theoretical. So, before using a cell phone, drivers should think to themselves, is this call really that important? The question is not being directed towards us, it is being directed towards the drivers. So this is perfectly acceptable for a 6th through 7th grade essay or paragraph. Then if we look at a different paragraph, okay, this one's quite long, I broke this up into two. We have the first several phrases. Let's look at this together. Contrary to the well-accepted belief, year-round schooling has no constructive impact on education. Most year-round schedules use the 45-15 method, 45 days of school followed by 15 days off. Because of this, there are many first and last days of school and they disrupt the learning process. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I've never gone through a one-year schedule and never gone through the 45-15 schedule. However, that does not mean I don't understand it. Why? This has been explained very clearly, so I know what the rules of the 45-15 method is and how the year-round schedule is mostly thrown up. So with that in mind, let's look at the thesis. Okay, contrary to the well-accepted belief, this is our big point that we're trying to make, that the year-round schooling idea, the concept of it, has no constructive impact on education. Now, constructive here meaning it is building upon, like the word construction, very similar. This is how we can use that word here. We want to also pay attention to the words contrary to and because of this. Now, this is one that I will accept for the 6th to 7th graders, middle schoolers definitely, because this is a very easy phrase to use, as well as the words contrary to the well-accepted belief. In fact, I would just memorize this entire phrase as a whole. Now, it sounds very complicated, but if you just use this portion by yourself and, add it into your essays, there's going to be no problem with it. In fact, this is a very often used phrase to introduce a opposing idea. So if you use this, very good on you. I would highly recommend writing that down somewhere and remembering that when you write something like this, you have to make sure that you are coming out with a truth, okay? When you say contrary to the well-accepted belief, you need to give me something that is not only the opposite, but something that has to be more often true, like a rumor or a lie that most people tend to remember and believe without realizing that it's not quite true. Then we have the rest of the paragraph. Also, there is no evidence of higher test scores. Due to that, many schools that change to year-round schedules end up switching back. It is obvious that changing to year-round schooling does not help students. Therefore, the change is unnecessary. I think this is the best example of transition use thus far because every single sentence, every single independent clause, I'll say that instead, every single independent clause has a transition of some kind. Also, due to that, it is obvious that, therefore. And in fact, it is adding on. It is giving me more information. It is giving me more commentary. What is commentary again? Let's think about it. It's when you are given evidence and then you are expanding on it. How are we going to expand on this? How are we going to describe it to the reader so they understand better? All right, so now we're going to be going into what I would consider probably the most important part of the writing section in particular when we're talking about essays and the variety of essays we might be experiencing, which is the book report. Now, this section is going to be cut up into 3 different parts, talking about the 3 different types of book reports that we can do. And I hope that through this, you will understand the importance of why I'm spending so much time on book reports. So for today, we're going to be discussing the plot essay, which is probably the most simplest and easiest for us. As we go on, they will get progressively harder, yes. However, do not worry, we'll get through this together and we'll go through it slowly. So for today, our objectives are to learn what a plot summary book report is. So we want to be able to address the following questions, which are: what is a book report? Then, what is a plot summary? Parts that are necessary for the assignment, and how to portray your own opinion about the story or novel yourself. Now, this is really important as, again, this is one of 3 different types of book reports you can write, as well as the fact that this is an assignment that will often be assigned to students between the ages of, say, I would say maybe 10 to 18. In fact, I will also say this does continue on into university, funny enough. Oftentimes, this is an assignment given out to elementary and high school students as well as middle school students for their summer assignments. So it's very important that we keep an eye out for book reports and see how they might be able to evolve throughout our academic career and perhaps see what exactly we might be running into in the future. So to begin, for the writer to know, we need to understand that a plot summary will be required regardless of what type of book report we choose to write. So this means that regardless of if it is a character or a theme book report, we will still have to add some kind of plot summary. In fact, this should be somewhat familiar to you. Remember how I was talking about we needing perhaps background information, or if we need to summarize a book or an article, that we would have to include it somewhere. Same thing, we would have to include at least a few sentences or a paragraph at most for the other types of book reports. So you can really consider this the foundational and the baseline book report that we will be writing regardless of perhaps what it is that your teacher is asking for, as it can always depend on the teacher themselves. If you are ever given the chance to pick your own book for the assignment, there will be suggestions along the way. There will be suggestions throughout these PPTs, as well as at the very end of the entire lecture series, where I will be suggesting a myriad of books that you can do wonderful book reports on, as well as presentations. Now, this is really important for a lot of students, just as a side note, because oftentimes we choose the wrong books, the not interesting books. However, as somebody who is well read and has read the majority of these books, I can assure you that you will have a great time actually writing an essay about them if you tend to enjoy the subject. So, with that being said, let's go straight into what a book report is. So here I have the definition written out. A book report is a project. It can be written or presented up to the teacher that describes, summarizes, and evaluates a novel or short story. So pretty much all you're doing is, as the name suggests, reporting on a book, just discussing a book, talking about what it was saying, the themes, the characters, the plot. It's all up to the teacher again, but normally that is what you will be doing. But what's the objective of this? What is the point of assigning this? Well, in fact, it's somewhat more superficial than you might think. It's not to test your writing skills or anything like that. In fact, it's to make sure that the student has done their reading. Yes, I know this is very frustrating for a lot of us because for students, even myself when I was your guys' age, this was a big thing, making sure that the student has actually read the homework. So for that reason, book reports are often assigned as perhaps pages or perhaps a short essay. And oftentimes these kinds of reports are easy to write, very short, quick, simple, and honestly not that big of a deal once you understand what exactly the teacher is looking for. But it also, I will say, helps you create a train of thought and analyze the book on your own, which is going to be very important once you get into high school and university, because if you ever take a humanities class, meaning social sciences or perhaps a literature course, this will be the majority of the work that you do. So keeping this in mind, let's go straight again into the required aspects of any book report. We will always, this is imperative that we remember that this will not be replaceable. We do not leave this out of a book report. This will go in your introductory paragraph. You never forget this. This has to always 100% be in the essay, which are title and year of publication, then the name of the author, the genre, the main subject, the plot, the theme, whatever it is that you're going to be discussing, and a summary of the key points. And then lastly, near the bottom, such as the conclusion or final body paragraph, you will include the reader's response. And then throughout the essay itself, you will add quotations for support and examples. So these are all the required, the necessary things for any book report that you might be writing in the future. Key things to remember about the book report, however, is that you are not writing this to criticize or compare it with other pieces of fiction or nonfiction works. This is not a compare and contrast. You are not required to compare and contrast one book with another book. In fact, you would be creating more work for yourself. And please do not criticize it, as it is still considered a work of literature. You are not in a position to criticize it or critique it, so take it for what it is and try to figure out what makes it interesting, what makes it cool, what makes it fun to read. That is your objective. You are simply reporting about it. There is no bias oftentimes on whether or not you think it is objectively a good or bad book. Also not considered a research paper. This is also important. When you are normally assigned a book report, you will not be using secondary sources. If you don't remember what secondary sources is, I suggest you go back to one of our beginning videos to figure out what that is. But it's not considered a research paper because you are oftentimes just using the book itself, and it has to come from you. All your analysis, every single part, will come from your own head. So please keep that in mind. Anything else that I want to mention to you guys is that it always has to be in chronological order. Imagine if you read a book, but suddenly all the pages were just mixed up and you didn't know what the beginning or the end was. Same thing for your own personal plot essay. It's important that we stay in chronological order. For the other two essays, I'll get into those in a minute, but for this essay in particular, we want to stay in chronological order. Then we also want to write it as if we are suggesting it to the reader. Imagine the reader has never actually read it. And when I say reader here, I'm talking about the reader of the book report. We want to make sure that we are trying to sell this book. What's so interesting about it? What's so good about it? I'm trying to convince the person who's reading my essay to take a look at this book as well. That is your objective, and if you keep this in mind, normally many students are able to appropriately finish the project. So I think that these are all key things to remember when you're writing a book report, regardless of what the book report might be. So the first step towards the advanced English coursework that will require essays written about particular assigned readings. It will also depend on what your reader wants, but 3 things that you should always include are the plot, the setting, and impressions. I kind of went through that fast. Let's break it down a little bit. First step towards advanced English coursework. This means any coursework that you will be doing from like say today, tomorrow, to maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now. All the English coursework, all the literature coursework, I'll say, will be based around this book report, because this is where we start to branch off. This is how we get our thesis. This is how we get our dissertation, how we get our in-depth analysis. It all stems from this one project. So understanding how it works, understanding how we can write it here now will allow us to have the foundation to write a proper, very advanced academic book report, or just a simple analysis essay. So we need to keep this in mind. And then 3 things that we always need to include is that we always want to remember to include the plot. This is probably the most important, because if we don't know what the story is, it won't make any sense. So again, just like I mentioned earlier, a plot summary is always going to be required regardless of what the essay is. We always want a few sentences, if not an entire paragraph, depending on what your teacher wants. So plot is always important. Plot. Always remember that, plot. So what is a plot? Actually, this might be a lot of a review for many of you guys, but I think it's necessary. If we're going to be talking in depth about it, we need to go over it. A plot is a series of events in any story, and honestly, you can just think of it as a big hill. This is going to be a very familiar a diagram for many of you guys, and I think it's important that we go over it very briefly and really use this as a review to understand what exactly I am talking about. So we'll have our 5 basic components, which is the introduction or the exposition, then the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then the resolution. This can also be referred to as the... And so we are on to our last style of book report, which is our theme analysis. Now, when we talked about how we had the 3 different types, we've done the easy, now the medium, now this is the highest difficulty. Reason being is because this is one of those topics that will come up quite often once you get into high school. I would say maybe 3rd and 4th year, perhaps your last 2 years of high school is probably how you want to think about it, as well as the rest of your career henceforth. So anytime there's literature after that point, you might see this quite often. Now, does that mean that it's not going to show up on your personal book reports? Absolutely not. In fact, your teachers might often say, talk about a specific theme. And how do we prepare for that? We talk about it through a book report such as the one right here. So today we're going to be discussing how we can really look into a theme, how we can analyze it, as well as some of the common ones that we might be experiencing when we are reading. So again, as for our objectives today, we want to discuss what is a theme, really clarify what we mean when we're talking about themes, thematic ideas, and etc. What are some common themes that we might be experiencing when we're reading? Because oftentimes when we think about themes, we might say that there are a few that we might experience. However, there are a choice handful that often show up, and their derivations also show up. And so we want to keep that in mind when we're trying to read a book, trying to keep an eye out for things that we might want to jot down in our notebooks. And then lastly, which one do I choose when I have to do a theme analysis book report? Now, this is also very important, kind of like how we talked about our character analysis, not like our plot summary, but it's something that we have to choose, something that we have to pick often if the teacher does not give us a specific prompt. So when that happens, which one do we discuss and which one do you think we should choose just in general, just in case perhaps we have too many that we can choose from? So that's something we want to keep in mind. Every story will have a theme, no matter how short it is, and a lesson we learn as we walk away from our narrative. So just to put in perspective, no matter how long the story might be, no matter if it's a few sentences or a few paragraphs or an entire series of books, there will always be some kind of central theme that we want to discuss within the narrative or within the literature. So because of that, we need to keep an idea of perhaps how many we want to talk about as well. This can be a bit more challenging for a few of us, but I doubt it's going to take us too long to actually discuss this. For the writer to know about the theme analysis book report, we need to make sure that this is one of the more consistently assigned essays as you get into higher education. Reason being, well, at this point, it won't actually be considered a book report. That's what's really important about it. It will just be considered a theme analysis or an essay about themes. When we say this, it is in our heads a book report, but pretty much it's the exact same thing. But we will be seeing it quite often in advanced courses, advanced placement, international baccalaureate, and university level, AP and IB for short. So why am I mentioning this now? Again, this is one of the hardest ones that we can write, but it's also one of the more frequently assigned ones. So what does that mean for us? We want to get a head start on it, understand exactly how we could probably break down a theme, and try to really focus in on what they might be looking for when we are writing this type of essay. Themes can be the most difficult as it takes more effort and comprehension to write this book report successfully. While our plot summary was the easiest because all we had to do was exactly just read the book, look at the plot. That's all we had to do. That was our summary. That's all we needed. And then perhaps a little interjection at the very end saying what we thought about it. That's all we need for a plot summary. However, for a perhaps character analysis, we have to look through the book in its entirety, pick up little pieces of information, and pretty much synthesize it into their description physically, what kind of character they are, and perhaps the role that they play in the conflict or the plot. But for the theme, this is an overarching idea that starts from the beginning to the end. Everything in this book will be discussed, and it's very difficult sometimes to see how a theme can really evolve for a character or for the plot itself. So we want to keep that in mind when we're reading a book, trying to look at themes. It's something that's going to happen in the beginning, middle, end, and evolve. Also, it's much more difficult to pick out the quotations that might be perhaps discussing a specific theme. That is why this part is so crucial and so important we discuss. So when we talk about a theme analysis and we really want to just get into it very slowly, what is a theme? This is the main idea or ideas the book is trying to teach the reader, a universal idea that explains a moral or a lesson. A moral or a lesson. This is the lesson that we are taking away from the book. Most books often have a conclusion, again, with our introduction, our rising, our climax, our falling, and then our resolution. Reason being is because they're trying to teach us something. We are trying to learn something from a book. Now, you may think to yourself, well, this isn't a textbook. We're not really learning anything. We're just reading a story. But when you read a book, there is a certain idea that's brewing. And when I say this now, you might not think about it, but when I give you examples, you'll definitely see what I mean if you do not see it already. All stories, books, plays, poems, and art have a theme. This is something that is all throughout any type of, I would say, man-made structure, any man-made piece of art. This is something that is quite often seen in humanities, especially in literature and art. This is because when we tell a story, when we want to explain something, we have often a theme that we want to go along with, and finding this theme can be difficult for some. Even movies and songs. This is probably a more modern, contemporary way of seeing it, but even songs and perhaps movies have clear themes and ideas that it wants to teach the watcher or the listener. So to really put in perspective, I'm going straight into the themes, showing you, not really explaining, but showing you how a theme can really show itself in a story. So I brought you some very simple, easy kids' fables to look over with the idea of theme analysis in mind. So for the story of Tortoise and the Hare, this should be something that we've all heard of before. This is something we probably have heard, read of, perhaps I would say about the 30,000 times, right? So this is something that we're quite used to. The tortoise is slow, the hare is fast. Hare takes a break and loses a race against the tortoise because they were prideful and decided to take a nap. So what is the moral of the story? What is the theme that it is trying to explain to us that is perhaps the reason for the story existing altogether? Slow and steady wins the race. That's how we can see it. The tortoise is slow, but they never stopped, therefore they won. Or you can also see it as don't be too prideful, don't be too egotistical. The hare was very egotistical, thinking that they could win and just running off into the sunset, but in the end they still lost. Why? Because they were so prideful, they thought they could take a break. Because of that, that is what we can see as our theme. How we would analyze it is a bit different. I'll get into that, but this is how we can consider finding a theme. This is how we can actually find one through a story. I have a few more here. So the boy who cried wolf. This is also something very popular. It's difficult to trust people who lie, so always tell the truth. Boy cried wolf too many times and now suddenly nobody believes him when there's an actual wolf. Don't tell lies because at one point, if you tell too many, nobody's going to ever believe you, even if you're telling the truth. Then Lion and the Mouse, or The Mouse and the Lion, which is a story about acting and giving and perhaps helping one another out. When you give an act of kindness, the act of kindness will always come back around and somebody will always help you, which is why you should always be nicer to the people around you, regardless of how they treat you. Why? Because that kindness will be returned in favor of you. So with that, there are 7 common literary themes that we can see in any literary work. Now, when I say 7 common, does this mean that these are the only ones that we'll be seeing in literature? Absolutely not. There are hundreds more, but these are the 7 ones that we can see as perhaps the most common, the ones that you could probably see in any literary work. But the only thing that we really want to truly keep in mind here is that they branch off. So we have these general themes, but they become more specific as we move on, and you'll see what I mean when I go into our novel discussion. So 7 common literary themes are love, good versus evil, coming of age or growing up, then individual versus society, prejudice and judgment, survival, and power and corruption. These are probably our 7 most common. In fact, there are probably 14 or 15 most common, but I narrowed them down even more for our sake, so it's easier to grasp and understand. So, not all these themes will appear or happen at the same time. This is also a very important part. Not all of them will always happen. Actually, and there are plenty themes that we can discuss in books. There are a plethora that we will be experiencing as we move forward and read more advanced books, or perhaps just regular other books, such as the ones for entertainment purposes or just because we want to, because there's always books that we want to read, right? Literally hundreds upon hundreds. This is not an exaggeration. There are hundreds upon hundreds of different types of themes, and they become much more specific, so it always depends on the book or the story that you are reading. However, something that we really want to keep in mind, and I would pay real close attention. And so here we are with our argumentative essay samples. Now, last time we talked about what exactly an argumentative essay is, but for today, let's actually see it in action and try to really look at the essays themselves and see how we could perhaps be arguing our own perspectives, and perhaps in the midst of all of that, we might be seeing if we agree or disagree with the questions that are given. Now, for today, of course, we're going to expand on the needs of an argumentative essay. We're also going to be having an in-depth discussion with 2 sample essays that I've prepared for us, agree versus disagree, of course, and 2 separate topics. What points to consider will also be something we're going to be discussing throughout our analysis of the paragraphs, as well as the process of applying our lessons into one essay. Now, you probably remember how we had so many of those videos at the very beginning talking about what is necessary for a writer. Anything that is a basic information, perhaps rules we need to keep in mind to make our writing better than a simple sentence. Well, this is where we're really going to be seeing all of that come into play, because we're going to be applying them into the paragraphs themselves one at a time. And so please think of this as more of an applied lesson or example lesson, where we're just going to be having a lecture and very comfortably discussing what happens in an argumentative essay and seeing how we can improve upon our own writing. Think of it as a workshop. If you like something, write it down and apply it to your own essays. So just as a review of the format, we have our introduction, which will of course have our thesis statement, which is important because that, again, shows us, the readers, whether or not we agree or disagree with a certain topic. Again, if your thesis statement is not strong, if it's not clear, then there is something wrong with the essay already. We need to make sure it is the most clear and easily understood part of the entire essay. Without this, we could be suffering. So please remember this and please write it down somewhere. Then we're also going to be talking about body paragraphs, of course, in the format, evidence and explanation, as well as taking a look at what we might want to strive for and avoid. Not saying that there's something that we really want to avoid here, but there is something that we're going to be discussing later on in a different essay that we might have to keep an eye out for and think to ourselves, is this right or is this wrong? As well as our conclusion that wraps it up. And for practice, because introductions and conclusions are very difficult for many students, the more that we can see, the more we can understand and learn from other essays. But for today, we're going to also be looking at 4-paragraph essays instead of the common 5. Why is this? Because we have our similar sections. Having 3 body paragraphs, of course, is wonderful. However, once we get an understanding of what exactly we need to include in our essay, the 3rd paragraph is unnecessary. So for today, we're just going to be looking at our normal 4-paragraph essays, which you might also be very used to writing. So there's nothing wrong with this, just letting you guys know if you're wondering why there is a paragraph missing in the middle. So for today's argumentative essay topic, we are going to be discussing if we agree to the question of, does television make children act out violently? Now, for this question, for this example in particular, we're going to go with the agree option. We're going to say yes. In fact, television does make children act out violently. Now, again, this is not a persuasive essay. This is not going to be me telling you my opinions about why I think a certain way about this topic. In fact, it's the complete opposite. I will not be saying my personal opinion. I will just be stating instead that this is correct because of the following reasons, proven by fact or quotations. What do I mean? Well, let's get into it and we'll discuss. So of course we have our agree option, we have our introduction. Let's read this together and discuss our thesis statement. Children are great imitators. Imaginary play and modeling their favorite characters are commonplace among the young, and they can and readily do imitate what they see. Therefore, it can be said that viewing violent and aggressive behavior on television does indeed directly affect children. This is a very good introductory paragraph. Now, I know I always say don't use our simple sentences too much, but as you can see, the hook is a bit different today. The hook is surprisingly short and surprisingly to the point. Children are great imitators. Very short and simple, but why is this effective? Because it is exactly that, short and simple and to the point. There's no dallying about, they get straight into the topic of the question, which means this hook also ends up showing up in the thesis statement here, which I have bolded for us, which is clear and decisive. Where do we want to really pay attention to the thesis? This bottom part, saying viewing violent aggressive behavior on television indeed directly affects children. This is our thesis, this is our claim, and this is something that I think that with a few different vocabulary words, we could easily write. But more important than that, I think we need to amp it up a bit. We need to make it a bit more advanced. How do we do that? Look at the transition there. Not just the transition though, all the way up to that point. Therefore, it can be said that up to here. That is something that you want to be writing down as well in your own personal essays, wherever it may be. Reason being, it's a very, very strong way, an incredibly strong way to start off a sentence and show that you have a specific opinion about it. Now, you can tell right now that there are no personal pronouns, no I, me, my, there's no first person perspective or second person perspective. But because the author says, therefore it can be said, who's saying it? Who's saying it can be said? The writer's saying it. This is where if they have an opinion, if you have an opinion, this is what you would write. This is how you show that this is what I personally think about this topic. So I would say that this thesis statement is a 10 out of 10, right out of the park, very strong, very clear, and very well written. Then let's look at a body paragraph. Through imitation and repeated exposure, children can learn. Learning violence is no exception. Simple sentence, but straight to the point. This person is very good at that. It can be imitated and learned in the same manner as how the alphabet is committed to memory. The only difference is when children watch negative behavior, it is that negativity that they learn and mimic. So up until now, we can kind of see a common sense idea. If children can imitate things that they see, who's to say they're not going to be imitating something that is negative? So up until now, this is more just background information, some more context to the actual question itself, and explaining to the reader this is what can happen, but that's not quite substantiated yet. Which leads into the very next paragraph as it follows. Going straight into a very strong quotation. According to the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Now, this is not something that we're going to be saying, let's break down every single word here. No, in fact, this is probably just an academy that has released the study, and this is the name of their academy. So we want to just be stating it the way it is. Just look at it. Doesn't that seem like something that you would want to trust if they were to come out with something regarding children's psychiatry? In that same way, we want to find sources that really are strong and make a clear statement on their own. Extensive viewing of television violence by children causes greater aggressiveness. Very simple sentence. This sentence itself is practically what the other person has been saying in their personal opinion area-ish, talking about the background information. But because it's now quoted by a very strong source, suddenly the argument is tenfold stronger. It is not something as harmless as the ABCs. Authorities on child behavior agree that what a child watches do indeed affect their behavior. Commentary and further explanation. So let's look at this a bit closer. It is not something as harmless as the ABCs. This part is just adding on, explaining, giving a little bit of a quip, trying to add on to this quotation here. But what does the next sentence say? Authorities on child behavior. Who are the authorities on the child behavior? Them, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. These are the authorities that agree with the main writer's point. So here we can say that the quotation is strong and the commentary is strong. And this goes straight back into their body information. And so we have a very solid body paragraph that is presented to us about the impact of television. Then let's look at the next body paragraph, which uses a different kind of quotation, I will say, however, a quotation nonetheless. Young children see violence on television and they have a difficult time differentiating between what is real or what is make-believe. Thus, they imitate all that they see equally. Now, this is a very long sentence. I don't expect us to be writing at this level. This is definitely a 7th, 8th, I would say maybe 8th or 9th grade level writing essay, but this is still something that we want to be striving for. So if there's a word in here, please apply it to your own essay. Studies show that children who watch too much violence on TV appear to be more unwilling to cooperate and are less patient with both their peers and adults. No quotation, but still concrete evidence. Why is that? Why do we consider this a very strong piece of concrete evidence or a quotation? I put those in quotes. Well, clearly it's because of the word at the very beginning of the sentence.